I'd like to ask the ambassador if you make a distinction between the public's right to know.
Sound.
Do you distinguish between the public's right to know an equal amount of information about a very small donor versus a very large donor?
I don't make a distinction. It seems to me about the same thing. The key is whether a candidate might be influenced by that donation, and let the voters decide whether that offends them or not.
Actually, so again, my apologies, lawyer. The courts have made a distinction, although not a very powerful one. The courts have recognized, I think, a very commonsensical proposition that these disclosure laws have the greatest effect on people who are small donors, who aren't political in their daily lives, who, frankly, have better things to do with their lives than pay attention to politics most of the time. Not everyone is a politician. Not everyone is involved in that sort of world. Not everyone wants to make it their lives or have politics be at the very core of their existence. I mean, we've already seen the politicization of everyday life, it seems, right? So the courts have said generally, look, the threat is from large donations or large donors. Those are the ones who purportedly create all the problems. I don't think they're real problems, but that's what they say. So why is it then, what's the justification for requiring someone who gives 20 bucks to a candidate to disclose their name and address when we know that disclosure has real chilling effects? And we know that the public's not really going to learn anything interesting from a person who gives $20. Unfortunately, what the Supreme Court has also said is, notwithstanding this obvious observation, we're not really going to enforce it. We're going to leave it to the good judgment of the political branches to decide where these lines are. Which sounds good until you realize that the political branches are full of incumbents who are in a position of power, who can use the power to make laws to silence the people they don't like.
Mr. Miller, you have 30 seconds.
Yes, I would like to speak to what Paul said, that the effect of this is on small donors. Again, I can speak only from Texas. We don't require small donors to disclose. You have to give at least $50 to be considered a donor. And I don't believe that anybody who is able to give that amount of money in politics is going to be discouraged by disclosure. They may be discouraged because they don't want to give money, because they don't have that much money. And that's why what we're really talking about here, once again, are not small donors, but very wealthy people.
Thank you. Our next question. I'm going to go to the fifth row, the gentleman in here. Yes. Thank you. You have 1 minute for 30 seconds for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Entrepreneur, for being here. I had a question specifically for you, but also for Mr. Abelard. Recently, TEC passed a rule on principal purpose that would apply political committee status to some organizations with a principal purpose of politics, as you would say, less than 50%. And I'll read a quote here for you. Were we to interpret principal purpose in the definition of political committee as suggested by appellants, so that corporations making independent political expenditures morph into political committees under the election code, and then it's a little references 2002 law, would be an affront to the First Amendment. That was the Third Court of Appeals in December of 2014 on a different case. So my question, very briefly here, is A, were you aware of that ruling? And B, do you disagree with the Third Court of Appeals?
I'm going to wait until the U.S. Supreme Court comes down on a Texas case or some other case on this matter, because as we've seen in the gay marriage issue, you can get all kinds of different opinions from courts of appeals and certainly from district courts. So I politely and with respect dodge the specific answer, but would like to speak to the issue of just what the Texas Ethics Commission did. The state law said, and we had no option but to try to interpret the law, that a group is a political group if a principal purpose is politics. And we've now defined that as a full range of political activity, that is engagement in campaigns as opposed to lobbying or other public policy advocacy. That is a verbal math that basically says that a group can have 3 principal purposes, and only if one of them is political must it then report as a PAC, as a political committee.
You have 30 seconds.
Thank you. That is not an outrageous consideration for organizations that truly are interested only in advocacy. It's only when they get involved in campaigns for or against candidates that then that becomes a public interest requiring disclosure.
As I said in the beginning, I'm not going to comment on any particular Texas issues, and I was actually thinking specifically of that proposed rule change because I don't want to be a Texas lobbyist. I'm a lobbyist in too many states already, but it does highlight some issues that the federal courts have long struggled with ever since Buckley v. Vallejo. I talked earlier about the very narrowing constructions that Buckley v. Vallejo imposed on federal campaign finance law. And it did it for 2 reasons. One, it recognized that all of these burdens weigh very heavily on the exercise of First Amendment rights. And the second one was, of course, that the government just generally doesn't have an interest in figuring out who's speaking in the political realm, right? We have an interest in knowing what the government is doing. The government doesn't have the interest in knowing what we're doing. That's not the way our system works. And so there are federal cases out there that talk about, primary purpose versus major purpose. The last time that the Supreme Court spoke on this specifically was Buckley v. Vallejo way back in 1976. So I think that the status of federal campaign finance law as of today is that in order to be a political committee, regarded as a political committee, you have to have the major purpose of influencing the outcome of an election. And we read all of those terms very narrowly, lest they get away from us and the government start regulating things that it has 0 interest in regulating.
30 seconds.
Yes, I'm going to use my 30 seconds to reassure Paul that you are not a lobbyist in Texas. Under our law, a person is a lobbyist if they are compensated to have a direct contact with a member of the legislature or the staff. And if there are any members of the legislature present here, that doesn't count. Just making a comment in a public body does not make you a lobbyist. I hope, a matter of some reassurance.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Is there a question from this side of the room? If not, sir, right here in the center, you're right in front of me.
Thank you. Good geography. Thank you. My question is for Ambassador Untermeyer, whom I love but disagree with strongly on this issue. So 3 specific examples and how you would handle them under the disclosures laws of what I consider pretty strong persecution. The Mozilla CEO was fired from Mozilla for supporting traditional marriage, which the opposition learned of through California disclosure requirements, and he lost his job. Buc-ee's here in our lieutenant governor race supported Dan Patrick, a federal government official. Congressman Joaquin Castro called for a boycott of Buc-ee's. If there was a government-endorsed boycott of a business that came about through campaign disclosure laws in that case, would you consider that serious? The next one is the inauguration of Governor Abbott. One of the contributors turned out to have been involved in a domestic abuse case. I'm not encouraging domestic abuse. I doubt that he was contributing to encourage domestic abuse, but he was vilified in the newspapers and tarred Republicans as being for domestic abuse and chilled other people from giving if their disclosure is going to be used by the media.
Sir.
So the question is your reaction to those 3 concrete, actual examples.
And I don't claim to know much more than what you've just told us here. It seems that in the Mozilla case, the individual had the option to give or not to give accordingly, knowing that there might be some reaction. Maybe the executive didn't know that that would cost him a job. But if that's the case, then I'd say it's really not a matter of disclosure law or of political law, but of employment law. that he has an argument on that ground against his ex-employer, that he was unfairly let go for exercising a right of free speech. Boycotts and these particular matters also strike me as similar in that they clearly are involved in the political process, and people who get involved in the political process should know or must know that it can be rough and tough and unpleasant. But it doesn't make that a matter of persecution that is worthy of throwing out a disclosure regimen which serves such a great and broad public purpose.
So I agree with you. Probably not a big surprise. I think one thing that your question and examples highlights is not something that we always think about, which is the ways that disclosure, government reporting, is different today than it ever has been in the past. And when I say the past, I mean all of human history. And I say this because of the internet. What a wonderful thing. Well, the internet has also made, the information age has also made intimidation and misuse of this information much easier. Until the computer age, all this personal information demanded by the government was essentially kept in paper form. It was all filled out on papers, and then you send it to the government, and some nice government bureaucrat put it in a file, for a couple of years, and then it was moved down to a basement, some musty basement, where you had to go thumbing through everything to find it, right? Well, what happens with this disclosure information today? It's all electronic, it's sent to the government immediately uploads it to a database that is searchable, that is available to everyone literally in the entire world. And so not only is that information much more available today, it's also much more permanent. Beyond that, there are groups that mine this data for very useful information. In the 2012 elections, Huffington Post worked with a group that data mined all this information that geosynced campaign disclosure forms with Google Maps, so that you could go onto Google Maps, punch in your home address, and see where all your donors or all your neighbors had given money during the 2012 campaign. There's an app for your smartphone that allows you to take a picture of like a food label in the supermarket. It'll pull up all the information about the employees who work for that company, the CEO, the unions, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Plus, that information is out there forever. Brandon Ike, who you're referring to at Mozilla, gave his donation in 2008, the same year that President Obama said he was against same-sex marriage. He was fired in 2014, when 6 years later, that information still being out there, the world had turned around on him.
30 seconds.
Thank you. Once again, what is at issue here is the involvement in politics by very few, very wealthy people who use organizations as the medium of their political activity, and who use these laws to avoid disclosure. That is what's at stake here. All these other cases are really more for froth than anything else. The internet may be at fault, more than the laws. In fact, that is an egg that cannot be unscrambled, unfortunately, but it should not cause disclosure laws to be rooted out as a result.
Questions? I believe it's a young woman in the very back row on the end. Oh, this side, I'm sorry. I forgot my geographics. Thank you for catching me.
So I think something that we've heard here tonight is that, for at least for Mr. Untermeyer, the goal is in informing the electorate, informing those who are heading to the polls. And I consider myself to be kind of above average engaged in the process. And if I see an ad from Planned Parenthood, I immediately know who the speaker is. I can judge whether I care about that particular message, and honestly, it doesn't really matter if it's from the Planned Parenthood PAC or the Planned Parenthood C4. So my question is, who are these individuals who are seeking more disclosure to better discern the messages coming forth in political campaigns? Is it the teachers, the UPS driver, or are they elected officials and agency members who are unhappy with the content of those messages that are coming out?
You make a good point that with Planned Parenthood, you pretty much know what you're getting, what they stand for, and therefore a candidate receiving their blessing would be considered sympathetic. The problem comes with these groups that have very vague names that mean very little, that have patriotic sounds or some other kind of indistinct wording that doesn't tell you what they do and what they stand for the way Planned Parenthood or AARP or the NRA might have. That is the problem here. Those are the groups that are using anonymity in all of its different guises in order to keep the public from knowing what you can know by looking at a group like Planned Parenthood and who they give money to.
So, some courts have said, well, maybe there's a difference. Sorry, I keep doing this. I keep coming back to what courts have said. Some courts have said that there's a difference between donors to the NRA or Planned Parenthood because people know who they are already, and we don't get anything from their donors. But these anonymously named, or these mysteriously named Americans for Mom and Apple Pie groups, well, we don't know what they stand for, and so when they speak, we need to know who's standing behind them, so we'll know, in the words of the Ninth Circuit, if there's a wolf in sheep's clothing, right? Well, what's interesting is two things. One, you've just said that, look, donors to big established organizations really have more rights because we don't need to know who they are. The second thing that you've said is that, well, we need to know who these smaller groups are. I come back to the fundamental proposition that, look, if you want to know if some speech is true or not, or useful or not, or is getting at something that is worth listening to, look at the speech. No one's hiding this speech, right? The speech is out there. That's the reason people are complaining about it. The speech is out there and it might convince someone, so we have to know more about it. Well, you can evaluate speech on its own merits. You can always do that. You can always evaluate speech on its own merits. And if you don't want to do that, which is your right, by the way, if you want to ignore speech, that's your right. But that's the thing, you can ignore it too. So this notion, I mean, the problem is really that people are concerned that voters are, frankly, too dumb to figure out what's good for them. That's not a good way of running a democracy. And if it's true that voters are too dumb to ultimately figure out what's good for them, well, then the republic's already lost.
Paul very much believes what he has said several times here, which is that speech speaks for itself, or positions speak for themselves, or issues are in combat. But we know that in the actual practice of government and politics, it is people who get involved. And we need to know who those people are, left and right, good or bad, wolves or sheep, in order to be able to make an informed judgment. And when a person gets elected and goes to Austin to legislate, and when a bill comes up before the body on which that person may have to vote, we need to know just who gave money to them in the campaign.
Thank you. Now I'm going to go to the young woman in the back that I missed a lot of.
I guess my thought process is about, I'd like to always speak to character and money, big money specifically, and how where big money is going helps us be, as citizens, say, evaluate character for those folks that are giving big money. And backstory of that, I used to live in St. Louis, Missouri, and so when all the rioting happening out there, and then come to find out there's a backstory that George Soles put a lot of money towards that, and so I'm like, that guy is extremely evil, and I saw a town that I used to live in, and I have a vested interest
30 seconds.
Completely be destroyed, not completely, but a big portion of that area. And so now I know that this is somebody that I want to know where that money is going and how I can avoid anything that he gives money to. So I would like to know, what do y'all think in terms of being able to evaluate character, somebody's character that gives big money?
So it sounds like it was probably directed at me. I would first of all note, as you often do in a debate, that that question goes beyond the scope of what we're debating today. Remember, when we're talking about dark money, we are talking about, by definition, contributions to nonprofit organizations that do not give money to candidates or associate, coordinate with people who give money to candidates. If you do those sorts of things, even if you believe everything I say today about dark money groups or nonprofit groups, it doesn't change the fact that we're not talking here today about disclosure in other sorts of contexts. I'm against disclosure in other sorts of contexts as well, but that's that. Now to the more general point, I reflect on what you said, and it's essentially, I want to know more about this guy because I don't like him. Well, I mean, that principle works both ways, right? People that we do like are also want to be targeted by other sides. And an election is not a riot. Again, the worst thing that can happen with money to a nonprofit organization is that the nonprofit organization may say someone that convinces a voter of something. That's not a constitutional harm. It's not a harm the government can be concerned with.
You have 2 minutes,
2 minutes.
because the reverse.
Oh, all right. I wasn't planning to quite take that long, but I do believe that the questioner's question is apropos to our discussion because, yes, we are talking about dark money groups, and I think that may be the only time I've used that phrase, but they do not exist in the ether. They are not mere accumulations of electrons or some other form of phantasm. They are an expression of individuals who have a particular point of view. And we need to know who those individuals are in order to make the informed judgment. It may not be on the question of character. It may be on the question of their philosophy or their past actions. It may be on the basis of whether they live in state or out of state. All those considerations, I think, are valid to know. And to the degree they use a group to hide themselves, then we are the lesser and we are the poorer.
I guess I'd just go back to one of the thoughts I had originally, and I probably said it 5 or 6 times today, which is that ultimately, of course I lost my train of thought, of course. Ultimately, when people pool their money to get involved with speech, right, they're just exercising another First Amendment right. It's now the right to associate or expressive activity. And we don't lose the right to speak privately, anonymously, by also exercising our First Amendment right to associate. That you just can't do those sorts of things. So again, I ultimately come back to the notion that speech is best judged on its own merits, and it's those sorts of things which tell us what we really want to know. And the cost of losing privacy to get at some things, I think, is just too high.
Is there someone on this side? Then you're close enough.
Thank you. Ambassador Undermeyer. I read a lot of articles online. I like scrolling down to the comments section, where you'll find all sorts of comments. A lot of people comment anonymously. And as a reader, I can discount comments the way I like if it's from an anonymous poster. Do you feel that individuals are fundamentally ill-equipped to properly discount speech if it's from an anonymous person, just on their own, without the help of government?
I give all rights to individuals to make whatever judgment they want, but I think their judgment is enhanced by full knowledge, or at least access to full knowledge. There's no harm in anonymity for its own sake if it's a citizen. Where I'm concerned, and the only reason to mention it in tonight's debate, is when individuals use a constitutional garb to create anonymity in a certain situation in which their identity and their position or their character, their state of residence is of interest and of value to a voter making a decision.
I guess in the interests of full disclosure, I should note that the questioner is an IJ lawyer, so hello, Reef. It was mentioned earlier today, the Federalist Papers. There's a funny story about the Federalist, well, maybe it's funny if you're a geek like me. We know that the Federalist Papers were originally published anonymously. Do we know why the Federalist Papers were originally published anonymously? Well, for one thing, people hated the authors, right? We think of them today as these great Americans. They're just like us, 200 and some odd years ago. They were just politicians who certain people hated. Hamilton, for example, was one of the lead authors. He was killed in a duel with Aaron Burr, for God's sakes. You can't get much more disliked than killed in a duel. And many people hated Hamilton. One of his great biographers wrote that he often received attacks jeering at his foreign birth, his supposed racial identity, his illegitimacy, and his putative links to the British crown. Attacks that set a pattern for the rest of Hamilton's career. Since critics found it hard to defeat him on intellectual grounds, on the merits of what he said, they stooped to personal attacks. Unlike Hamilton, Madison was not a controversial figure. People really liked him. But nonetheless, he benefited from anonymity too. He was a Virginian by birth, and he lived there all of his life. And given the localism of the time, the concern was that New Yorkers, where the Federalist Papers were first published, would reject an argument out of hand if raised by one of those dirty Southerners. So here we see the two issues, or one of the key issues with anonymity that we sometimes forget, which is that people oftentimes, whatever you want to think about privacy, also want to keep their personal identities hidden so that people will work on the content of what is being said rather than focus on the personalities, offensive personalities that are saying it.
Thank you. 30 seconds.
Paul has given a great argument why anonymity is good if you're writing a Federalist paper. I do not hold that it is a desirable thing when it comes to electoral politics. That when James Madison actually put his name on a ballot, then he was exposed and it was ready for the voters to make their decision. And if, in those days, a shadowy group had wanted to support James Madison, then I think the public in that part of Virginia should have known. We have no idea if that is what happened in his case, but it is our circumstance, and that is what really counts here.
Thank you. Is there anyone on this side? Because there are, all
I
right.
think we're going to have one last question.
We're only going to have one.
He had one. I have.
Okay.
Thank you, Ambassador. We've heard tonight some specific examples of reprisals, retaliation, intimidation that has come through disclosure. But we've also heard you talk about the abuses of wealthy individuals hiding behind 501c3s or trying to affect the outcome of elections. How could you give us some specific examples of why you believe these examples exist, and maybe some specifics so that we know that this is not just a straw man that we're talking about?
Well, we know that these organizations exist. We know they do get involved in politics. And what we don't know is who the individuals are. Now, those people may have fear of physical attack or some other kind of vilification, in which case we also have laws to protect people against that. What I'm saying is that politics is not, as Will Rogers said, beanbag. And I, as a former politician, have been attacked or vilified, not viciously, but I knew that was part of the game of putting my name on the ballot, of getting involved. What I find offensive are those people who, for their tender sensitivities, do not want their name identified with their cause. What is wrong with that? They are not likely to be subject to that kind of abuse. They have powers of wealth and protection far beyond ordinary citizens, and that is why I do not weep for them.
So I think we're talking about two different things. The first is we're talking about candidates, people who willingly throw their hat into the ring, people who are very consciously put themselves literally up on a stage to talk about issues. I'm not a candidate, but I'm one of those people who likes to willingly put himself up on stage and talk about these issues. Part of which is that I have really thick skin. Lots of people have said very nasty things about, I haven't even run for office, and lots of people have said very nasty things about me. And I'm not really bothered by that, probably because I'm an insensitive jerk. Not everyone is an insensitive jerk. There are lots of people for whom politics is not a full-time activity or even a pastime. It is something I think about only once every 4 years if I'm lucky, and even then for not very long. It's those sorts of people who are, I think, most threatened by these sorts of laws. And saying, well, after the effect, well, if you're harassed, there are laws that can protect you, maybe, possibly, doesn't really help if it comes after the fact. And as we see more and more organizations get more and more strident, I think, unfortunately, get more and more strident about what they believe and the not just wrongness of their opponents, but the evilness of the other side, right? This is a real problem that permeates our political discussions today. It's not that the other side is foolish or mistaken, it's that they're evil. Well, that sort of approach to politics leads to the sort of intimidation, tactics that we see today. Life is already far too politicized. We can't keep making every decision